Hi, I'm Lynn from FromOurBookshelf.com, and I am sitting on the floor today, which is why there's kind of a bit of a strange angle, and that is because I have a huge stack of books next to me, so it's either just easier to sit on the floor so I could grab them. I'm going to do a little something different today, and that is I want to talk about a specific author, and this is a Christian author, and that has written over 40 books. I am going to share, I think 22 of them today. Could be wrong on the number, but I'm going to share the ones I own by that author, although I've read more than I own because I read them years ago and no longer have the books. But that author is Elisabeth Elliot. She is a well-known Christian author that I think she passed away in 2015. So she was like very popular in the late 1990s, and I recently read a couple biographies about her, which kind of got me on this rabbit trail, this researching and remembering. Even though I've read a lot of her books over the last 30 years, it kind of got me thinking about the books that she's written, and I put together a whole list of all of her books, which is 40 some books, on our website, FromOurBookshelf.com. So if you go to FromOurBookshelf.com and search Elisabeth Elliot or Elisabeth Elliot books, the list will come up, and there's like a little explanation on each book about when it was published, something about the life of Elisabeth Elliot in the beginning. So if you like the complete list of titles, then check out FromOurBookshelf.com. But what got me kind of researching and thinking about Elisabeth Elliot again was this book, Becoming Elisabeth Elliot, and this one, Being Elisabeth Elliot, both by Ellen Vaughn. It's kind of a 2-volume set. I read this one, I think, I have to see when this one was published. Let me look real quick. I should have looked before now. This one was published in 2020, and I believe I read it in 2020 or 2021. This is about Elisabeth Elliot's life and kind of leading up to when she left the mission field and came back to America. If you're not familiar with Elisabeth Elliot, she was a missionary to Ecuador, and her and her husband was killed by the tribe that he was trying to witness to, and there was 5 missionaries total, if I remember correctly, one of which was Nate Saint. There's also multiple books out about Nate Saint and the whole incident, horrific thing that happened to those 5 missionaries. But that is kind of what made Elisabeth Elliot and the 5 missionaries story become like known worldwide when it happened. And so this book is about becoming Elisabeth Elliot. It's about her childhood, her college years, meeting Jim Elliot, going on the mission field, and then a little bit about life after he died, and how she dealt with that and serving the tribe that killed her husband, serving in the tribe that killed her husband. So this was really good. It gave you a realistic look into Elisabeth Elliot's life. I will have a full review of this and the second book in the series, which is Being Elisabeth Elliot, soon. I'm going to do a whole separate post. I have a lot of thoughts on these books, and I'm going to do a whole separate post, and I'll try to do a video to go with these as well. This one is Being Elisabeth Elliot, so it's on her life after she came back to the States, on raising her daughter Valerie. She got married a second time, was widowed a second time, and then got married a third time. And so this is about kind of her second half of life, but not exactly second half of life, but it was her life after she left the mission field and coming back, and her life as a writer. This again portrays Elisabeth Elliot as a person. She was not perfect. You would be surprised about some of the things that happened to Elisabeth Elliot, and that maybe she did and that she believed later in life. This book is really good. I loved this book again, but I have a lot of thoughts on this book. Sorry to leave you hanging on that, but I will share more about this soon. This video is going to be actually about the books Elisabeth Elliot authored, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But I'm also currently reading this one, which is, yes, I'm going on like an Elisabeth Elliot deep dive, which is Elisabeth Elliot, A Life by Lucy S.R. Austin. I'm not very far into this. You can tell so far I would say this is a little bit more academic. There's a little bit more details, like about she went to Wheaton College, about missionaries in that time period, about fundamentalism. So I don't know. I can't give a complete review on this. I would say this one by Ellen Vaughn's maybe a little bit easier reading, more personable. This one, the Ellen Vaughn ones are authorized by Elisabeth Elliot's daughter, who shared the journals with these authors. So again, I don't want to go on a deep dive on those. I will share another video and blog post on those 3 books soon. Today, what I want to talk about is all of the books that Elisabeth Elliot authored. And as I was reading these books about Elisabeth Elliot and her life, I realized she wrote a lot more books than I realized. Now, I started reading Elisabeth Elliot back in like the early 1990s, shortly after I became a Christian. A friend's mother gave me one of her books to read, and I just went on. I read Jim Elliot's biography. That kind of started my love of Elisabeth Elliot. I kind of have slowly collected some of her books and read them over the last 30 years. Well, I thought I had read like the majority of Elisabeth Elliot books. If you had asked me, I would say, oh, she has 20 some books, and I've read all but 2 or 3. Well, sorry, I just hit the fireplace thing. But after reading this book, I was like, wow, I had no idea that Elisabeth Elliot authored 40 some books. Now, there's a little bit of debate on how many books she authored because she did booklets and pamphlets, and multiple of her books have been republished with different covers, but several of them have also been republished with different titles. And the book on loneliness, I think, has been retitled and republished like 3 or 4 times. It's a little bit confusing. I came up with a list of like 43, I think 44. Today I'm going to share, I think 22 or 23, and that is because these are the ones that I've owned. I have not read all of these. I've read the majority of the ones I'm going to share. So I was just going to do a little brief thing on each book that I have here, and I'm doing this because I know a lot of it. Elisabeth Elliot is a very popular Christian writer, and I think there's a lot of books that she's written that people don't know about. So I want to help kind of tell you about some of the books that you may have missed by Elisabeth Elliot if you love her. I will say I do not agree with everything Elisabeth Elliot has written. She's got some different views than me, but I do think there's a lot to be gleaned from her books. There's a lot of value and learning to serve God and trust God during trials. She was widowed twice. She worked on the mission field. Reading her biographies, I learned even more about the trials she suffered in life. And I just think there's a lot to be gleaned from her, even if you don't fully agree with everything she believes, has said, or has written. So let's start with her first book, which was published in 1957, Through Gates of Splendor. This is about their life serving in Ecuador, and then kind of leading up to her husband's death and the death of the 5 missionaries that were killed by the tribe. So that's what this book is, kind of that part of the story. The second book she wrote was The Shadow of the Almighty. This was published in 1958. It is about the life of Jim Elliot. So this one I just read, this is more about the missionary life, serving the tribe in Ecuador, and the killing of her husband. This is actually about Jim's childhood. He grew up in Oregon, and Jim's college life, meeting Jim at college. It is about kind of their missionary life before they got married, their marriage, and then some about serving as missionaries. So again, this is more of a biography of Jim Elliot. I read this probably 30 some years ago and really enjoyed it. I own 2 copies of this. This is more of an updated copy. Like I said, a lot of these books have may look different than ones you have or you have seen because the covers have been updated so many times over the year. I will put this one up. This book is a bit controversial. If you know anything about Elisabeth Elliot, especially the last few years, you probably know that this one's a bit controversial. This was written in 1960. This is about Elisabeth Elliot serving in the tribe in Ecuador that were called, and in this book they call them the Auca Indians. There's some controversy on that name. I think the correct name is the Waidoni, and I'm probably not saying that correctly. But anyway, this book is no longer published. It is, if you have a used copy, apparently this copy is worth a whole lot of money. I wish they would retitle this, kind of update it for modern times. But this book was written in 1960, and you have to read it through a 1960 lens to appreciate it, I think. But this still has a lot of good information on it. Like I said, I wish they'd retitle and update some of the language in it because it's an amazing story. Elisabeth Elliot went and served as a missionary in the tribe with the people who killed her husband. And there's not many Christians, I think, that can say they would be willing to do that. So this is an inspirational story, even though it's not currently correct to today's time. So the next one I am going to share, and I have to pull this up on my iPad. I did not know much about this book. In fact, I didn't even really know she wrote a novel, No Graven Image, and this was written in 1966. This is not available anymore, except I got it on Kindle. You might be able to find used copies, but if you can, they're super expensive. This was not well received by the Christian world. A lot of people thought she was not portraying an accurate life of missionary work and missionary of what they went through. And although it's not based on Elisabeth Elliot's life, it is a novel. She used a lot of things she learned on the mission field and what she went through in Ecuador to write this story. And like I said, it was not well received. I have not read it. After reading about her writing it and the controversy regarding the novel, after reading her biography, I was like, oh, I've got to read that book. But like I said, I bought it. I haven't read it. It's no graven image. It was published in 1966. Grabbing my next pile. So the next one she wrote was also released in 1966. This was Let Me Be a Woman. This one is still available. This is a really outdated copy. I believe this is probably the copy I read as a teenager. This is about living a life as a Christian woman. You may not agree with everything in this book, but there's a lot to be gleaned from this book about living as a Christian woman. Like I said, it was written for her daughter. The next one is God's Guidance, A Slow and Certain Light. This was published in 1973, and it is Reflections and Reminders of the Enlightening Counsel of God. I do not think this one is still available. And then we have These Strange Ashes. This was published, I had trouble finding the exact, this is a newer copy. I read this one years ago, and I don't have my older copy, or at least I can't find it. So I'm not sure the exact publication date. I saw several publication dates online. I saw 1975, 1976, and I think there was a third one listed. So I'm not sure why it was so hard to find the exact publication date. But this is basically her personal reflections of serving after Jim Elliot was killed. So the one I talked about a little bit ago was more just her story. This is actually more personal, more reflections, kind of a little bit different of a view. This one, The Mark of a Man, has become, like Let Me Be a Woman, kind of a Christian classic on Christian manhood. It was written in 1981. If I'm remembering right, this was written to her nephew or maybe a friend or family member. She wrote this for somebody. Again, very outdated cover. This one has been updated to look more modern. It is still available. Made for the Journey, 1979. This was a reprint of this one from, I don't know if it's an exact reprint. They may have updated it some. Obviously, it has an updated cover, 1979. I actually think this is another updated cover. This is not the 1979 cover. This is a newer copy. So this one, All That Was Ever Ours, it was published in 1982. It is Elisabeth's writing on grief and struggles. I have not read this. I have this used copy. This is no longer available. You can only get it used. Some of these that I'm talking about, they're not available, but some of them you can get on Kindle. Others of them are ridiculously expensive to buy used. So this one, Discipline, the Glad Surrender, 1982. This is on the Christian life and living with joy. I read this years ago, a different copy. This is an updated cover. But this I really enjoyed when I read it years ago. We have Passion and Purity. A lot of you may recognize this if you're familiar with like the Christian circles of the late 1980s and 1990s. This is Passion and Purity. It's about Christian dating, Christian marriage. It's about Jim and Elisabeth's story of their long dating. And again, you may not agree with everything in this book. There is a lot to be gleaned though on Christian dating and lessons from Jim and Elisabeth's dating life. Again, 1984, this is an old cover. I actually have two different copies of this. I read this again years ago, so the current cover may look a little different than this. A Lamp Unto My Feet, 1985. This is on the Bible being our guiding light in life. I have not read this. Amy Carmichael, this is another one, well-known Elisabeth Elliot book. It was written in 1987. Elisabeth developed a love for Amy Carmichael and her writings and her life in college, and she wrote this biography. You may not agree with everything Amy Carmichael believed, but her life is a fascinating, inspiring story of serving Christ. Again, 1987, biography of Amy Carmichael. Okay, we have Loneliness, published in 1988. This book has been published, I think, 2 or 3 times with, well, more than that with different covers, but I think it's been retitled 2 or 3 times. I do not know why this one has been titled. I read it years ago when I was going through a really difficult time. I really enjoyed this book. It's probably time for a reread so I could give better opinions on it, but Loneliness, 1988. On Asking God Why, 1989. This is Trusting God During Your Trials. Again, I read this 20 some years ago, really enjoyed it. I think Elisabeth Elliot wrote obviously some biographies, some about her life as a missionary, but I think what Elisabeth Elliot does best is writing on suffering and trials and serving God during those trials, having a joyful attitude. She's written a lot on it, and I think that is Elisabeth's writing at her best, is when she writes on trials and suffering. Another one on suffering, A Path Through Suffering, 1990. This is about suffering, and that there is a reason for suffering, and there's a reason that God gives us suffering. Again, I read this years ago, really enjoyed it. The Shaping of a Christian Family. This was published in 1992. This is about Christian families and raising kids in a Christian family. A lot of it has to do with Elisabeth Elliot's childhood. She was raised by Christian parents. So I do not think I've read this one. Again, this one has been, there's multiple different covers for that one. Keep a Quiet Heart. This is a 1995 book. This is a devotional, but it is not dated. The chapters are just more like devotion, meant to be like a devotional, but they're not dated. So I read this years ago. I'm pretty sure I read this years ago and enjoyed it. A Quest for Love, 1996. This is stories on Christian dating. This one kind of goes along with Passion and Purity. The Music of His Promises was published in 2000. This is another one about trials and suffering. I read this years ago. I think I read this shortly after it came out, which would be like 24 years ago. And again, enjoyed it. It's probably time for a reread. Secure in the Everlasting Arms. I have not read this one. It was published in 2002, and it's about clinging to God in trials. Again, another one on suffering. I think if you read like every single Elisabeth Elliot book, you would probably hear some of the same stories over and over again. So I'm not sure if I will read all like 40 some books she has, because it might, especially not one right after another. If it's been like 10 years since you've read it, then it might not matter. But I think a lot of her stuff probably overlaps. And then this is Be Still My Soul, published in 2003. This is reflections on the Christian life, and the title is based on her one of her favorite hymns, Be Still My Soul. So she published multiple other ones later than this. There's a book on suffering that was actually one of her, I think it's Suffering is Never for Nothing, that was published after she passed away, that was based on a talk she gave. Like I said, this is only 20 some of the books, and weaved within, there was missing years and so forth in there. The whole list of 40 some books is on our website from ourbookshelf.com. You can search Elisabeth Elliot, and the list will come up. I try to post one Sunday a month. A Sunday reading is what I call it, and it is where I share a Christian book that I have enjoyed or that's been beneficial to me. This list was for a Sunday reading, but again, it's a whole list of books by Elisabeth Elliot. For more books, book reviews, bookish talk, we have a wide reading range from historical fiction, nonfiction, Christian books. Check out FromOurBookshelf.com.